Well, if anyone stumbles upon someone with cone flowers, I am on the lookout for some good cone flowers. Before we break through our kind of chapters for today, can you remind me your name?
Robin.
Hi, Robin. We have a new guest with us just for this week. So we are journeying through the Bible. Today we're going to finish Numbers. And every week we kind of stumble into new places. And usually some of us have really strange questions. So Bill, any strange questions that came up this week?
Well, one thing that interests me in this Numbers, the last 4 chapters, evidently there are 2 Mount Hors. There's one where Aaron died.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 34, Mount Hor is kind of defines the northern boundary of.
Did you read a commentary or did you notice that on your own?
I noticed that, but then
that's impressive. Okay. That's impressive.
Well, what has always fascinated me, they've got 10 tribes and 2 half tribes. And they're trying to divide this land up in proportion to the numbers in each tribe.
Yeah.
And they had no technology. I don't think they even had magnetic compasses. So they, north, south, east, and west was just wherever the sun was. And how they did that without resulting in a civil war, because this is my turf, I'm this clan, and another clan says, no, I have more in my clan than you have, therefore I get some of this. None of this is recorded, but that had to go on, and it's just fascinating that it's not in there, and just how they actually decided. You might have a river, or you might have a mountain range, or some geographical feature.
Yeah.
Like, like the
mountains and hills.
The boundary between North Carolina and Tennessee is a ridge over there, and North Carolina didn't want the rest of it, so they gave it to Tennessee after the Battle of Kings Mountain, and John Sevier used that to divide up, pay his lieutenants. But anyway, back to the Bible. It's just interesting how they were able to define these areas.
Well, we are going to have a map that's going to show the boundaries given, and you might be surprised by how big it is. The description.
How big it is?
Yes. The description of the boundaries of Israel. Well, when we get there, you'll go, what? And we call it Greater Israel, or the Greater Promised Land, is this large, it's like a whole part of the known world.
It might be big, and I'm sure they needed, if you're grazing cattle, you only get 1 pound of meat for every 13 pounds of food. But 2,000 cubits is only 3,000 feet. That's how big their cities were supposed to be, 2,000 cubits on a side. I guess that was where they had their religious services and maybe their wells and maybe their social life. But these cities had to be much bigger than that, because that's only 4/9 of a square mile. It's only 300 acres.
Are you talking about the Levite cities?
Huh?
The Levite cities? Can you hear me?
Yeah, the Levite cities. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So there's funny boundary things. And when we come to our map, we have 2 new maps we're going to look at, and I'm really excited. And we'll talk about some of the funny mountains. But yeah, Mount Hor is that place that Aaron died 2 weeks ago. And then later in the description, there's another Mount Hor named. And the funny things about ancient mountains is they move around and they change, because there might be a famous mountain, and so you might be walking and go, hey, I think I've seen that mountain before. That might be Mount Hor. And Mount Sinai is one of those. We don't actually know where Mount Sinai is. And so we think it's the same mountain as Mount Horeb, which is down below. Because in Deuteronomy, it talks about Mount Horeb. In the books we've read so far, it talks about Mount Sinai. And so Bible scholars went, well, that's probably the same mountain, but we don't really know. And so mountains are funny like that. They move around, they change, and they walk away. especially after a couple generations. Any other questions that popped up from this week, or maybe even leftovers from last week? Yeah.
I thought it was strange that they had the islands of refuge for criminals, whether it was premeditated or not,
Yeah.
depending on where you went.
So that was one of the things I remember. I think I was in middle school, and like a normal sixth grader, I was like, I'm going to read through the Bible. And the idea of refuge cities was one of those that really stuck out with me. One of the really cool things about that, if you know anything kind of about the ancient world, before there's a lot of police around, if someone wrongs you, then you or your family gets revenge. And so these idea of refuge cities, it's introducing a very good justice system that limits revenge and retribution. And so I'll be excited when we come to that, and then we're going to play a video that's going to talk about some of that in the ancient world as well. That's one of my favorite parts. I remember as a sixth grader, like, oh, I kind of wish we had those. In case I ever got in trouble, I could run to a refuge room until Dad got home. Any other parts that stood out for anyone?
And the part about Z's daughters, that when they married, they married within the clan to keep the land.
Yeah.
If they married else to another tribe, they lost the land.
And I find it strange in my mind that that's how Numbers ends, is talking about the 5 daughters and inheritance. But it leads us really well into, we're ready for the promised land because inheritance has been figured out and with our clans. Well, on our check-in map, 2 things. One, so last week was our week of covering a lot of material, including the war and the violence and genocide, and our conversation went like 30 minutes or more over last week. So at the end, when we finish, we will come back and revisit that conversation about some of those harder texts in the scripture to deal with. And then today we're going to finish Numbers. Next week we'll do our Numbers wrap-up. So we'll do our kind of overview of the whole book and kind of looking at it from a bird's eye view now that we have read through the whole thing. And then I want to make sure everyone saw my email. So May 30th was when we were going to do our special topic on church history type things. But there is a diocesan youth trip that most of the group going is from our church group. And this kind of sprung up in the last couple of weeks. And as of 2 days ago, there were no chaperones. And so I'll be driving the Knoxville kids, and we're going to Charleston. And I will be at the beach, so I will miss you while I get sunburnt. And then, again, we'll be off in June. We'll come back on July 11th to start the book of Deuteronomy. So as a reminder, we're in the book of Numbers. Our tagline for it is Rebellion in the Wilderness, and its Hebrew name is In the Desert or Wandering, and so that's where we are. We're wandering in the desert, and we keep rebelling. Next week, we will go back through every single chapter, and so I'm not going to remind us of where we've been in the weeks before, but this is where we've been in the weeks before. It's there in the PowerPoint in case anyone wants to go back and look at it later. And this is where we were last week. And we covered quite a lot of different materials. So there was the aftermath of the Baal at Peor. And so that's that moment where the Midianites kind of led Israel into worshiping the god at Peor and the response to that. We had a bunch of numbers last week with the second census. And as a reminder, we are 40 years later than when we began this book. Or we're at least 38 and a half years later than when we began. And then chapter 27 was that one that for many of us, including me, or at least for myself, was our favorite. And that was when we talked about the daughters of Z. And so I'll pass around my expensive picture for one use that we're going to get 2 uses out of. And so what really stood out in this story, it's when their father died. And each clan gets an inheritance in the land. It's a way that everyone has equality. Everyone has a means to work as they farm their land or pasture their animals. But their dad has died, and so they lose that inheritance, that claim to the land. And so if you remember, we looked at this art piece and we read the commentary by Pastor Lauren for this, and she talked about how in this story we see the vulnerable not only speaking up for themselves as they go into the tent of meeting, but Moses, who's in a position of power, gives them room to speak. And so it gives us kind of a call in this story, one, to speak up for ourselves, which can be scary. But there's a reminder that, remember, God speaks and says they are right. God is there with us. But sometimes we find ourselves more like Moses, where we're those ones in the position of power. And so one of our jobs is to give room for other people to speak. That was what one of my favorite parts from last week, so I just wanted to repeat that. We also looked at a few other parts, like in chapter 30, had to do with all of the vows, particularly vows made by women, because women always cause problems in ancient societies. And so, but our takeaway for that with vows is always let our yes be yes, our no be no. And then that question for ourselves, what are the vows that I have made to God and to others? Am I living faithfully to those? Those are good questions to always ask ourselves. And then there was Numbers 31, which is part of it was the war against Midian. But there's also that other part that happens, if you remember, when Gad and Reuben asked to kind of distribute the land in different ways. And one of the takeaways that we had with that last week is that it shows us the importance of working together and how we can pursue our own individual desires, but also benefit us as a group. And so Gad and Reuben asked to stay in that land across the other side of the Jordan. And the deal that they come with is they will get to settle that land, and they'll go ahead and fortify their cities, but then they will fight as the vanguard or the front of the army. And so they got a lot of benefits, but they also got a lot of heat because they would have died the most as they kind of went to war. That was what we looked at last week. And so now we're going to come into where we're looking this week, chapters 33 through 36. So the first part for this outline, I don't know why I had a lot of fun with these names, and I couldn't really pick one name for them. So I was feeling a little bit introspective as we're finishing Numbers. But the journey remembered, Egypt to the promised land. Chapter 34 is defining the promised land. We're going to look at all of the boundaries of the promised land. That's that map that I kind of threw up for just a second. And in chapter 35, it's the Levitical towns and the cities of refuge, which is what Susan was referencing earlier. That's loud. That's a loud beat. And then chapter 36, it's about protecting the tribal inheritance. That has to do back with the daughters of Z. And it's how the book ends. It feels like a strange conclusion, but we'll look at, when we get there, kind of how it ties into the rest of the book. And here is our map of all of the places that we have been. I'm going to pass around another map that we're about to look at. But if you remember, we started way up here in Egypt, in the land of Ramses or Goshen, and there's all these places that they traveled. It may have been Susan or Marilyn that was asking about the distance between, and one of the things I said is, it's kind of hard to make the distance of the path because we don't know where most of these places are. And so I have another map that I'm passing around. This is what it looks like. It has other places than this map because scholars will place the cities a little bit differently. Even the starting point of Ramses is a little bit different. And there is a bunch of towns that we just have no idea because a lot of these are just lost to us. And so chapter 33 mentions all of these stages that they have gone through. So before we had Ramses is up here. Some other scholars will put it down here. But here is roughly the path that they took. Some of it gets confusing. Our old map did this where there's like 3 or 4 routes that just kind of circle around each other. But eventually they end up here. And this is where we're starting. We're on the opposite side of the Jordan from Jericho. So there's the Jordan River. We're on the opposite side, still over there in Moab. But they can see Jericho kind of from across the river. And so chapter 33 is just a list of the 42 stages that they have gone through. It begins in Ramses, which is somewhere in Egypt. And again, it's going to end on that other side of Jericho from the Jordan River. If you're just like really curious, you could go to Deuteronomy 1 through chapter 3, and you could read an alternative itinerary of what they might have done. And it differs a little bit from this list. So if you just like reading names that you can't pronounce, there you go. You can do that this weekend since we have no homework for next week. I put as an underline, so we don't know where a lot of these places are, but we can make pretty good guesses, but we don't know just because there's no dig sites that we can go out in the middle of the desert and go, oh, this is obviously that town. See, its name is written up here. And that's just because town names change, places change, things get conquered, and in the desert, they get covered up by sand. Sorry, my throat is a little been funny since I've been sick. Interestingly, 17 of the names that are listed are only ever listed right here in this chapter. So they're not ones that we have gone throughout the whole book. They're not mentioned in Deuteronomy. They're not mentioned anywhere else. They only appear here. And if you compare this to other ancient Near Eastern texts, there's a few things that it kind of looks like. It looks like a military campaign that someone is kind of reciting. So if you look at other military campaigns and they'll list out all the cities that they have conquered, it might look really similar to this list. It also looks like a list of pilgrimage sites, which to me kind of was interesting. And those might be temporary pilgrimage sites, like they had some kind of cultural or religious significance, or even sites that they are going to settle. They might have military outposts or something like that. And then there's a lot of added religious commentary that happens on top of that. So you'll notice that, for instance, way back in the very beginning, around verse 3 or 4, where it gives commentary about the war with the Egyptian gods. And so it'll talk about how this was Yahweh showing Yahweh's power versus the Egyptian gods, which we talked about way back in Exodus. And then an outline, roughly, of this chapter, because I know you don't want to just read all the town names. There's an introduction. Moses is commanded by God to write this down. And so the first part of the trip, they go from Egypt to Mount Sinai. And if you remember our kind of outline of where we've gone so far, in the book of Exodus, they journeyed to Sinai, and then they stayed there for the rest of the book. And so the book of Numbers begins on Mount Sinai, and that's where the rest of it happens. There's the wilderness wanderings that are going to happen, and then the kind of middle of the chapter is when Aaron is going to die. That says My Hor. That should say Mount Hor. And then they're going to go from there to Moab, and that's where we ended up about 2 weeks ago. Moab is that place to the right of the Promised Land. And then the chapter ends with the final orders to kind of go into Canaan and make that their land. Any questions on this chapter? Not a lot of exciting points here. No? Fun fact that I learned while doing this, and let me make sure I can say the name right. Mount Sinai was called Jebel Musa, or the Mountain of Moses. And that is why they think that Mount Sinai is the same as Mount Horeb. That was new to me. I'd never read that anywhere, and I thought that was cool. So you can write that down and never remember it again. So again, here's our map. This is where we've been. I tried to think of some kind of takeaway for this chapter, so here we go. The wilderness journey symbolizes the Christian life, our own lives. We have a journey of faith, challenges, and growth. The Israelites' mistakes serve as cautionary tales, reminding us to trust and obey God, even when the path seems long and difficult. If you'll remember a lot of the pictures that I would put up while they were wandering through the wilderness and complaining, it would be like a complaining kid in a car or something like that. In a lot of ways, I think that's what we sound like to God so much of the time. And you can just think from God's perspective, like, we just defeated Egypt, the most powerful nation, and now you're worried because, like, your food's not salted enough. It's kind of the complaints that there is. And so that was my takeaway. I am curious if you have a favorite mistake from Israel along the way. My favorite is the passage with the quail, where they complain about not having meat, and then the quail comes out of their nostrils. But there's a lot of other really good ones, so I'm curious if anyone else had one that stood out in your memory.
what did you say your favorite was? The quail?
The quail, yeah.
Yeah.
That I just think I love the little small snippets of humor. And so like, we don't have any meat, so I will give you so much meat it will come out of your nostrils. Yeah.
Yeah, it's symbolic of, I'm going to give you something that's hard to catch and doesn't have much meat on it.
Susan, did you have?
I read a little conclusion called From Peak to Peak.
Oh,
So he's up on the mountain, the peak,
Yeah.
and he's getting a peek into the promised land. So it's
Oh.
P-E-A-K to P-E-E-K. From peak to peak.
is that one that stands out to you with Moses?
That was easy to remember.
I like that, the peak to peak. And Deuteronomy, I'll wait till we get there. I want to take us on a field trip, and we'll go from peak to peak, maybe. We'll wait. Any other ones that stood out to anyone? Oh, I was like waiting for like all these funny stories. I thought okay, all right. Robin, any ones that you loved from Numbers? That's chapter 33, not the most exciting chapter, but chapter 34 gets really cool because we get a map. And so this is the part where we're going to define the promised land. So we're going to define the boundaries and then the tribal leaders for each one. So one of the interesting things that happens here is, so roughly for this chapter, it begins at the Dead Sea. And so the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea is what it is in Hebrew, is the middle. And things go counterclockwise in kind of describing all of the boundaries. But it begins at the Salt Sea and it ends, again, at the Salt Sea. And a lot of scholars will have kind of different maps defining the boundaries. So again, one of the hard things with these descriptions is we just don't know. And we'll put "know" in quotes because we have guesses, but we don't know for sure. And so this is roughly maybe what the boundaries of greater Israel, the greater promised land, was kind of promised to be. And so for the southern border, it's going to begin at so you go to the tip of the Dead Sea, which at this time was a little bigger than it is now. And then it's going to go down and westward to the Mediterranean. The western border is just the Mediterranean Sea, which in Hebrew is the Great Sea. From the northern border, we're going to use Mount Hor. So this is what Bill was talking about earlier. We kind of had Mount Hor as maybe somewhere over here as where Aaron died, but now Mount Hor is somewhere up here. And then the eastern border, it's going to extend out to the next water, which is Mesopotamia. So the Tigris and the Euphrates, and coming over there to the tip. One of the interesting parts, we'll come back to the map in a second. So it's the appointment of all of the tribal leaders. There's 3 names that should stand out to you, and they're right there on the screen. But what names do you notice?
You're talking about a person or a location?
Of people. Names of people. Caleb, Joshua, and then Eleazar, the priest, who's my nephew's name. Anyone was curious. And so those are 3 names that stand out. So Joshua and Caleb are the only people from the first generation that are going to enter the promised land. Joshua is the leader from the tribe of Judah and will end up leading in the same way that Moses led. Caleb is going to be leading Judah. I said that incorrectly. Joshua is leading the whole tribe. And then there's Eleazar, who is going to be the high priest. You'll remember that moment with the Midianites. And Moses is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe everyone's hooking up with the Midianites. And then in comes someone dragging them into the marriage tent. And so Eleazar comes through with the spear to kind of stop the plague. So he is seen as this character that will do what needs to get done. And so he becomes the high priest kind of because of that. One of the really fascinating things for me, and there was no commentary that I could find on this, but you may have noticed it if you read the end of this chapter, when it lists all of the names, all of the southern tribes like Judah and Simeon and Benjamin, it just says their name. But all of the northern tribes, it adds a leader. And so there was no commentary, but to me, it looks like those may have been two lists that kind of get put together here. But yeah, no commentary. That was just something that stood out to me. We're going to look at another picture of this map, but any questions on either of those leaders or the boundaries? Okay, here's another picture of that map of Greater Israel or the Greater Promised Land. And so you can see it goes as west as you can go to the Nile River and as east as you can go to the Euphrates and the Tigris or Mesopotamia. Essentially, this is all of the known world, is kind of what the Promised Land would have been.
Have you ever personally traveled over there?
I have not, no. That would be cool. Oh, hold on a second, let me take a sip.
Maybe we need to fund a sabbatical for you. That would be
That would be-
fascinating.
We
to me.
get Christopher to lead a trip, maybe, and now tag along as an intern or something.
There's some problems right now, some areas that might be difficult.
Yes.
Well, you know,
I mean, we know several, churches who just did the Holy Land,
yeah.
annual Holy Land trip, and who knows?
I think I mentioned this last week that I had a friend that lived in Jordan for the summer, and it was funny as he could not go from Jordan into Israel. He had to, I forget what it was, he had to go out and around and come in from somewhere else, and then he got he got really questioned. He's like, "You've been to Jordan?" Because it was on his passport. So
Like today, there's just a floating road that connects one side to the other. It's not very wide.
did you say a floating rope?
Yeah, it's like in a swimming pool that you would rope off.
Like on the Jordan
so
River.
you can't swim to the other side even though you can see it right there.
Don't people do such funny things?
Mhm.
Like, isn't that so? Like this is my river. It's just a river. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, you don't need my
It's like
commentary.
Texas. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is pretty much all they knew, and that's why they claimed that particular area. Is that right?
Yeah. This is like most of the known world sort of thing for this area. I was going to say, so if you're really curious about looking at some of the other descriptions, because the one here in Exodus is really limited. Genesis 15, Deuteronomy 1:7, or Deuteronomy 1 and Deuteronomy chapter 11, and then Joshua 1 are further descriptions. I can send out that list if anyone really wanted to look at it, that are going to describe more of that promised land. Yep, there we go. That was all that I needed to share. Okay, this is like a funny ending to the book. It's like all your last minute bookkeeping type thing. But chapter 35 is really cool. So this is the passage that's going to talk about the Levitical cities as well as these cities of refuge, or sanctuary cities, if you wanted to call it that. Again, I really love this kind of description about it, and so we'll get into it when we look at it. But just as a reminder, the Levites do not have a land inheritance. So kind of this last section here of Numbers is, what are all the leftovers we forgot before we go form our nation, sort of thing. And so that's what we're getting, is all the bits of leftovers. And someone realized, hey, well, these Levites, they need to eat too, and we probably won't have enough sacrifices to feed all of them, so we should probably get something figured out. And that's what chapter 35 is about. So here is a picture. These red dots are the refuge cities. These are not the Levite cities. But there is going to be 48 different cities for the Levites to dwell in. And they are kind of scattered throughout the land. And so remember, the Levites are that priestly tribe. And then one of the things that Bill was referencing earlier, so they have a city, and then 1,000 cubits out on all sides is allocated to them as grazing land. Oh, I must have taken this out of my slide. I was trying to figure out how to get this into one slide. If I'm remembering right, it was like 1,438 feet was what 1,000 cubits was. But I might not be remembering that correctly. But it was about 1,500 feet.
1,500 feet.
Yeah. And so that is the grazing land around each town, which doesn't sound like that much room, but I guess that's enough for how small that they were. And then there's going to be this designation of 6 refugee cities. For me, that's really the part that stands out about this chapter. And I love this part. And so the chapter is going to go in very detailed and poetic language about what you do if you had an intentional murder versus an unintentional murder, and what you use to kill someone. So the very poetic language that will go through if you had a piece of metal, if you had a rock, or if you had a stick. And if you killed someone with those 3 things, then you were at fault because that's what you used to kill someone. However, if it was like a rock that fell off of a cliff, or you didn't see something, or you're, not in this text, but other passages, if you're accidentally ran over them with your cart, or they were laying on the road or something like that, that was unintentional. And so there's this big distinction given between what we would call manslaughter and murder. But there is a reminder, all blood shed is bad, and it pollutes the land, any blood that is shed. And so then it goes through what the punishment for murder is. If you murdered, it's the capital punishment. Then you have to repay with your life. There is no sacrifice that you can make that can take your place. You have to pay it with your own blood. And so, but that leaves the question, what do you do about unintentional killing? Or what about people that say, well, I didn't murder that guy, it was an accident. And this is the part that Alexander really loves, because we go through a little judicial system. And so they appoint 6 of these refugee cities, or cities of sanctuary. You might notice these 3, or recognize the names, Kadesh, Shechem, and Hebron. Those are the ones that are on the Promised Land side. And then there's the other ones, the Trans-Jordan cities on the other side of the Jordan River, Golan, Ramoth, and Bazar. And I don't remember Bazar, this city. The other ones I recognize. And these are cities that are scattered kind of all throughout the land. And the idea was, if you, A, murdered someone, or B, accidentally killed someone, you could go to one of these cities. I guess you'd want to get there really quick. And you could go there and essentially stand trial. And so if you were not in the city, anyone could get revenge on you, which is kind of how it worked in the ancient Near East. There's no police force. So if Janie killed my dog Sully, I'd come over and killed, Charlie? Cooper. Okay, I was just like, I said the example and I had C, and then I forgot your dog's name. I was like, and so I could come and kill Cooper.
Okay.
Well, you can imagine if I killed Jenny's dog Cooper, she would probably get mad, so she would come and blow up my car. And if she did that, I would blow up their house. And then she might kill my daughter, and then I would kill Alan or something. I don't know. But things escalate. And so this whole point is to stop this escalation. It's to stop these revenge plots from going on. You've read Romeo and Juliet, right? There was some youth here last night when I was working on this chapter. And I was like, well, have you read Romeo and Juliet? And she was like, nope. And I was like, oh, okay. But Romeo and Juliet has those clans, those families that are fighting, and things escalate. This whole system is to stop that in its place. And so there is a designated kind of revenge person. And so if the murderer was seen as guilty, then they could go and kill that person. And if the person who had committed manslaughter ever leaves this town, then they could be killed by that appointed revenge person. Unless the high priest dies. If the high priest dies, everything is reset. So it's a lot like a Jubilee year.
So, did you say they could seek asylum?
Yeah.
So a geographical cure for a problem, obviously. But
Yes.
okay.
And these cities are still Levitical cities. They're the cities of the Levites. And so they are under God's protection. The Levites are the representatives of God in the land. And so it'd be like living in medieval Europe and going against the Catholic Church. You wouldn't do that. And so, yeah, that's kind of how that works. There's a couple other lines that stood out to me. So, do not pollute the land. And so there's these other descriptions given. So any shed blood pollutes the land, but also you don't want to pollute the land in other ways. Yeah, Marcia.
What is the rationale of things changing just because the high priest dies?
Oh, it's like a jubilee year, and so it's like your sentence has been served, and so you are set free, and so it's a gift.
So what you want is someone kill the high priest.
You know, I was thinking about that. I was like, what if it's like the brand, like, oh man, like you got tried and it happened, and there's like a brand new high priest. And you're like, I can't wait for him to die. Because I don't know how often a high priest dies. It's kind of like the Supreme Court sort of thing.
So they couldn't, for murder, they had to have more than one person.
Oh yes, thank you for saying
What
that.
at 6?
So you have to have 2 witnesses
Was it
here.
just 2?
And which is another one of those things. There has to be more than one and different parties of witnesses that can attest at the trial. And so it really is like a justice system. It's like a court that you go through. So it can't be a he said, she said sort of thing. Although I guess if you had 2 friends team up on you, then you're kind of out of luck. There's also this really cool line about how God also dwells in the land, and that's that reason why you don't shed blood in the land. And so here we're seeing this whole place be this sacred place. If you go back in your mind to the Garden of Eden, this is like a restoration of Eden in many ways. And so, yeah, Bill?
You know, in the New Testament, there are endless references to the law. The
Yes.
law, right? Paul in particular is obsessed about this. Is this an example of what you would call the
Yeah,
Hebrew law?
So the Torah is the Hebrew word. This is part of the Torah, and there's only 613 laws in the Torah, and these are some of those.
Okay.
And so you have the 10 Commandments, you have the love God, love your neighbor, and then the other ones, 601. Those 601 include everything from religious ceremonies to dietary customs to geopolitics to justice system laws. So it's not actually a lot of laws, but this would be among those. And then there's how you interpret this. And so the rabbinical system might have this one law, but there might be 3 books on this describing its implementation sort of thing. What I really like about this, besides the whole idea of these cities of refuge, these safe places, this institution of a justice system, this idea that people have rights, that humans have rights, that shed blood is important because human life is important. These are all really cool factors. But it's how this kind of connects into the broader story of all of Scripture. So the Bible begins with this idea, there's this world and it's like chaos. And so God comes into this chaos and begins to push back those waters of chaos and kind of pulls up the land and makes this space. And God dwells there with people. And the whole idea with the Garden of Eden is that land is spreading. And it's the same idea for us as like the church. We're the place, God dwells with us, and we go out and we make that place bigger. We make God's space bigger. We make heaven on earth, like we pray every week in the Lord's Prayer. And you see that happening here. So God's not just way back there in the temple. God dwells in all of this land. And if you go back to this map, the hope is God will dwell everywhere. This is the whole known world. And so what we're seeing in Numbers, we're getting ready to go into the promised land and make this space for God. It's like we're bringing back the Garden of Eden, is very much so what's tied into this. And so this chapter, in many ways, it connects to that whole story of Scripture, which, you know, for the Christian story, it's continuing with us. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that part. Shed blood requires shed blood. I should have said those in the other order and ended on the happy notes. But yeah, I like that about this chapter. Any questions on this? In a moment, we're going to play a video that's going to talk about this practice as well. Yeah.
So Simeon is within the Judah
Yes.
land?
Yeah.
And it's just all surrounded by it?
Yeah. So the tribe of Simeon is down here. That's funny. You know, I don't have my slides. But way back the first census of Numbers, Simeon is pretty large. The second census of Numbers that we looked at last week, they have shrunk down to 15,000. And so by the time that this is written, the tribe of Simeon had been assimilated into the tribe of Judah. And so this is not really the best map, but here's the tribe of Benjamin. These make up the southern tribes, and then all of the rest of the northern tribes. So these ones go away with Assyria. These ones are left, but eventually Babylon comes and kind of conquers this area, the southern tribes. And when they're carried off in exile, Persia takes over and they come back. And essentially all that's left is Judah, and they shorten that name to Jews, those from Judah. And so, yeah, these other tribes are assimilated. And a lot of these people move into this land down here. It's a great question, yeah. And the Negev down here just means the Southlands, because you're south of everything. That's as you go down into Egypt. But even by the time this is written, Simeon doesn't really exist anymore. They've been kind of fully assimilated.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Even Gad has a finger that goes up into a river.
It's funny too. The tribe of Dan is either up here or it's up here, and we don't really know. That's again because names change and everything like that. We are going to play this video. I really enjoyed this one, so I'll just not say anything about it and play it. Well, God might not want us to watch it.
Incorporated into the law of The Bible records the ancient Israelite institution of cities of refuge. Incorporated into the law of Moses, these cities were to be an essential element of the Israelite justice system. They offered temporary sanctuary to people accused of murder and permanent asylum for those found guilty of manslaughter, the accidental killing of another human. In ancient Israel, the law called for anyone found guilty of murder to be executed, with no other ransom deemed acceptable. Capital punishment enforced the sanctity of human life and protected the land against ritual impurity. The belief was that human blood tainted the very land in which it was spilled. If Israel was to be a holy nation with God as their leader, atonement had to be made for every intentional murder, every intentional assault against the leadership of God, who had outlawed murder. There were still regulations on this capital punishment. First, someone accused of murder could gain initial sanctuary and safety by either grabbing onto the horns of an altar dedicated to God or by running to a city of refuge. The accused must then stand trial in front of an assembly of Israelites. To receive a guilty verdict, they must either admit to the crime or have 2 or more witnesses testify to their guilt. If found guilty, they would be executed by the avenger of blood, believed to be a close relative of the murdered person. If proven that death was accidental, the killer's safety was to be protected by the assembly, who would escort them to the nearest city of refuge. If they chose to leave the city limits at any point, the avenger of blood could kill them without consequence. If the high priest died during their lifetime, the guilt of the person charged with manslaughter would be considered paid for, and they would go free. The scriptures identify 6 cities of refuge, 3 on the east side of the Jordan River and 3 on the west side of the river. According to modern scholars, their placement meant that wherever you were in ancient Israel, you were no more than 30 miles or a full day's walk away from a city of refuge. Nevertheless, there must have arisen circumstances that necessitated a faster solution for temporary safety. And there are a few biblical examples. Adonijah, son of King David and rival to his half-brother King Solomon, ran to the horns of the altar, and initially he was granted clemency, later to be killed. The disgraced army commander Joab was also initially granted sanctuary by grabbing onto the horns of the altar. He, too, was later killed for his crimes. These instances demonstrate and clarify the quick reference to altar sanctuary found in Exodus 21 verse 14, which likely supplied Israel before the Promised Land with a way to follow the murder laws. This was, of course, before the establishment of the cities of refuge. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this spotlight, please like it, share it with a friend, and leave us a comment below Bible Discovery content.
I thought that was a cool video describing it well, as well as showing its use kind of in other parts of the Bible. When I kind of look at a takeaway of this chapter, to me, these cities of refuge, they balance justice with mercy, and particularly that blood vengeance or family feuds that could happen. And it's acknowledging human mistakes. So with manslaughter, things happen sometimes. And it's showing us also the value of human life. Even when I kill someone accidentally, there still is repercussions for that because people are so important. And in many ways, this foreshadows Christ being our own refuge for our mistakes. And so I think what I love most about that idea of these cities of refuge is we always have our refuge and we don't have to go anywhere because God's there with us all the time. And so that's the cities of refuge. Any questions there on that chapter or final thoughts or comments? Okay.
Is this your commentary?
Yes, yeah. Those are mine when I try to think of a positive note. And I have noticed that I have notes on the side of my computer. I forget to read them most of the time, so when I put them on the screen, it makes me say them. The section ends, or Numbers ends here with chapter 36. And the title I gave it is Protecting the Tribal Inheritance, but it's going to bring us back to the daughters of Z. And so here there is a concern with the tribe of Manasseh that they are going to come to Moses and they're going to say, hey, if these daughters get their inheritance and then they marry outside the tribe, then what's going to happen to that inheritance, that land, because it will be given away. And so God makes this command kind of through Moses and say that they must marry within their own tribe if they're going to keep that inheritance. And it ends up becoming the law for everyone. I feel like that's pretty simple enough of a description. And so the daughters of Z, they agree they comply with this command. And so they only marry within the tribe. And so then there's a brief summary that says that's what they did, and they're kind of praised for it. But this is the end of Numbers. And so kind of our summary for this book is like, the land is set. We know where the promised land is going to be. We have all the laws for what is going to happen into the land. Now we have figured out the inheritance and other family relationships. And so it's time to enter the land. And that happens in Joshua. And so Joshua's the next action plot, if you will. But first, they're going to do a recount of all of the law, or all of the Torah. And that's what Deuteronomy is. And so Deuteronomy is kind of Moses' version of recounting everything that has already happened and renewing the covenant right before they enter the land. And then you're ready for Joshua, where they come into the land. That's Numbers. Where we go? We finished it. Any questions on this chapter? This is kind of a repeat of what we had said last week, so I don't know if anything will stand out there.
I give a comment. The concept of marrying within the tribe is still very much alive in certain modern cultures.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about Judaism, but I have many Greek friends, and it's interesting. The mothers of Greek teenage girls are already looking around to see who they can match their daughter up with, because they don't want them to marry outside the tribe.
Yeah.
And that's not meant as a criticism. It's just a feature of their culture. And I'm sure there are probably many other cultures that are similar to that.
Yeah, well, and we talked about that way back in Genesis when we talked about first cousin marriage, and even like I don't remember the percentage that it was, but a more significant amount of the world than I thought of still favors first cousin marriages as the ideal way of marriage, and it has to do with that idea of keeping things in the tribe. When daughters marry out of the family, things go away, but when you marry like your cousins, it increases family bonds. It keeps the wealth in the family, stops it from being polluted and spread out. And so, yeah, there's a lot of societal benefits in that way. And not really that much genetic problems. It's the same amount of having a kid in your 40s with any kind of birth defects with the first cousin marriage. I don't know how much that's true after you've done it 18 times, but... this is the book of Numbers. So next week we will look back at this section. We will go through all of them again and see what stood out to us. We will play the Bible Project video again that we looked at when we began the book of Numbers. One of my favorite things is to watch those videos again after we've studied it, because different things will stand out to you for sure. Your homework for next week is not to reread Numbers. But I do want, I will ask you to go back and look at some of those parts you remember as the highlights and bring them next week for some of your favorite parts of Numbers, rather that just be because it's humorous and silly, like the nostrils of birds coming, or the meaningful parts. Right now, the thing on my mind is those daughters of Z and that call to action for us to stand up for people in positions of vulnerability and being that voice of power for people that do not typically have a voice. But when you go back, we'll find lots of moments like that. Again, we'll play this video that's going to go through the whole book. But before then, a lot of you last week wanted to talk about some of the hard text in Scripture that we didn't get to finish with talking about genocide. And so for those that don't want to be part of the conversation, the Lord be with you. My God, we thank you for this book of Scripture. We thank you for those parts that are inspiring, but also those parts that are difficult. We pray that you will challenge us, that you will stretch us, and we thank you that you are a God that we can wrestle with. And whenever we wrestle, we usually walk away blessed. Amen. Amen. If you don't want to stay, peace be with you. But if you do want to stay, we are going to look at that video that we were going to play last week, but did not. I love Janie's face right there. It's like, I know. So I do want to read this one verse. It's from 1 Peter. You might know it, 1 Peter 3:15. Does anybody know that verse? So I'm just going to read it so I don't say it incorrectly. This is a verse I grew up with, and it's what the apologetics or defending your faith kind of proof text verse is, but I still like it. So always be ready to make a defense to anyone who demands from you an account for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence, or reverence and respect is what a lot of verses say. I grew up being thrown that verse at me a lot for why I had to defend every single thing that happens in this book. And this is always the line I give. My faith is not in a book. My faith is in Jesus. One of the things I love about the Bible is the Bible helps me find Jesus and helps me find God. But this isn't where our faith is in. This is to lead us to God. It teaches us about God. It helps us draw closer to God. But when I come to texts like this that we looked at last week that seem to be committing genocide, they can be really uncomfortable. For me, as a Christian, I feel like one of my jobs is to have an answer for that. And so what I like about this video is it's going to give a couple of different answers that have to do with some of those harder texts like genocide. We mentioned it last week a little bit. Some people choose to just be really dismissive of passages like this and saying, well, I mean, so like if you're an academic Bible scholar, you would look at a story like what we looked at last week with the Midianites and say, there's no historical evidence for that, so this is not real. Even the account reads quite fanatical with 12,000 people wiping out entire nations. But that's not doesn't seem like a good enough answer to me. Other people will go through and say, this is good and holy, and God can kill babies and women and children because human life is worthless. We played a clip of a video of the pastor I grew up, like, that's who we listened to growing up. I hate that answer. And so this has some other ones, and yeah, we can play it and then talk about it.
Someone says, if God is so, you're in a conversation and someone says, if God is so good, how could he command genocide in the Old Testament? What would you say? In Old Testament passages such as Deuteronomy 7, God commands the Israelites not only to drive out the people who lived in the land of Canaan, known as the Canaanites, but also to take over their land and destroy them all. If God is so good, how could he command his people to do such a thing? The next time you're in a conversation and that question comes up, here are 3 things to remember. Number 1, God's command for Israel to drive out the Canaanites was not race-based, but behavior-based, as the Canaanites engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in civilized societies. In Canaanite culture, horrific acts such as infant sacrifice, ritual sex, bestiality, and incest were not only legal, but common. This behavior had been going on for centuries and was integral to the worship of their idols. These acts of cruel injustice had God's attention because God is just. He cares about the victims of injustice. At the same time, God's judgment wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. For centuries, God had waited patiently for the Canaanites to repent. In other Old Testament passages, God demonstrates that he desires mercy over judgment and is always willing to relent from judgment if the people are willing to repent. In fact, God had a reputation for showing mercy, not only to Israel, but also toward Israel's enemies. For example, you might remember that Jonah didn't want to deliver God's warning to the Ninevites, and he even tried to run away from the job. Why? Because he knew God would show mercy if they repented. Apparently, Jonah knew that God's justice always goes hand in hand with his compassion and mercy. Number 2, God is willing to work with people where they are, not where they ought to be. He works within messy human cultures to move them towards redemption. When the Canaanites refused to repent, God finally brought judgment in a language they would understand, the language of war. In fact, war was an everyday part of life in the ancient Near East. All nations at that time depended on war for survival or subjugated themselves to another nation for military protection. While it's hard for us to imagine a world where war is an everyday norm, God is always working within all cultures, no matter what their norm is. Just as we adapt our own behavior and language when we are in a different culture or country, the language of the ancient Near East was violence and war. And a victory by the Israelites, a much smaller and weaker nation, the Canaanites, suggested divine intervention. It's also important to note that God instituted rules and limits to war that were against the norms of the time. He limited the Israelites to warfare only within specific circumstances and time frames, or for specific purposes. God also limited who could fight, exempting those who had recently bought a house or a vineyard, or were engaged to be married, and even those who were just faint-hearted. There were even rules against needlessly destroying the nearby trees. God works with people where they are, not where they ought to be. And when he accommodates certain inferior conditions of a culture, it is to move people in a redemptive direction. In the case of the Canaanites, even beyond using Israel to stop their violence and evil, God was working to accomplish a larger plan, his mission to bring redemption to the entire cosmos. Even as he was judging the Canaanites, a seriously corrupting and evil force in the world, he was orchestrating the story of redemption, securing the land for Israel in which the Messiah for all nations would appear. Number 3, the Old Testament's mention of many Canaanite survivors shows that its total kill language is simply ancient Near Eastern exaggeration or hyperbole. Whenever we read ancient literature, we should try to understand the context in which it was written. including what kind of literature it is and the language devices that were normal for that time. If I tell you my suitcase weighs a ton, you know that I mean it's heavy, not that it literally weighs 2,000 pounds. If I say I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, you would know that, at least in Western culture, I don't literally mean I will eat a horse, just that I'm very hungry. There are common hyperbolic expressions in every culture. In the culture of the ancient Near East, there were stock hyperbolic phrases about warfare. Sweeping language with utterly destroyed bravado was common in ancient Near Eastern war texts. In that literature, victories were often described in terms of total conquest, complete annihilation, and leaving no survivors. One Moabite king wrote of his victory over Israel by saying, "Israel is no more." Both his ancient Near Eastern readers and readers today understand this was hyperbole and not literally true. The total kill language in the Old Testament command was closely followed by directions to not intermarry with the Canaanites, the ones who were supposedly to be wiped out. In fact, the biblical language of the Canaanite destruction is identical to that of Judah's destruction in the Babylonian exile, which clearly did not mean utter annihilation or genocide. In both cases, people from these nations turned to God and were accepted into Israel. God even made Rahab, one of the Canaanite women who turned to God, one of the great-great-great-great-grandmothers of Jesus. All this indicates that to some degree, the language used in the Old Testament about utterly destroying the Canaanites was hyperbolic. Passages dealing with God's command to drive out the Canaanites from the land are difficult passages to read, and we have to be honest with those difficulties and resist offering trite answers. But the first step to understanding what happened and why is to evaluate the context of the biblical narrative and the ancient Near Eastern culture. So the next time you're in a conversation and someone objects to genocide in the Old Testament, remember these 3 things. Number 1, God's command for Israel to drive out the Canaanites was not race-based, but behavior-based, as the Canaanites engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in civilized societies. Number 2, God is willing to work with people where they are, not where they ought to be. He works within messy human cultures to move them towards redemption. Number 3, the Old Testament's mention of many Canaanite survivors shows that its total kill language is simply ancient Near Eastern exaggeration or hyperbole. For what would you say?
So, am I coming through the speakers? I don't think I am. Oh, here we go. I wasn't. Okay. I don't know if you liked this video or not. This is one that I debated playing. I'm going to get rid of that picture. We'll put this up here. This is one that I debated playing or not playing, and I decided to go ahead and play this one because I thought it might be of comfort and a good starting point for a lot of people. These are still texts that make me deeply uncomfortable. I think it was Marcia that asked me afterward, and I am one that when I read text like this, I still, even with these kinds of answers, I don't love all of those answers myself. I have a lot of trouble with them. And so I am curious if there's a conversation, if y'all still want to have that from last week, kind of about all of these and what you thought of that video as well.
Well, I particularly like number 3. That a lot of it is just that's the way people talked at that time.
Yeah.
That's the way people did things at that time, and you can't evaluate it from our standards today. You have to evaluate it from their standards then.
Mm-hmm. There's one scholar, I think it was from the Bible I have on my computer, but it's the updated NRSV version. I have an older one that I have in print. And when he, or whoever it was that wrote it, compared a lot of the total war language that's used in the ancient Near East to like football players. And so like, I'm going to totally destroy that team. And that type of language would be just kind of typical for what you would use. Yeah, Marcia?
Listening to this and listening to you, I can understand or begin to understand the historical perspective. But when I take what you're saying, what they're saying, bring it into today's environment, it's a lot more difficult to understand.
Yeah,
And I'm talking about politics and international
yeah.
issues.
These are texts that I sit really heavy with. And the thing that I always remind myself is God's story is not done yet. And I like the part that they had, I think it was in their number 2, that God reaches to where people are, but the story isn't over yet. And the story is not done with us yet either. One of the things I love about the Episcopal Church is how we'll talk about how God is still using the Spirit to reveal and to teach us and to lead us into new places. When I look at stories like this, I don't see God in them. I have trouble with a God that says go kill babies and such. And so to me, the comfort that I find is the story's not done yet. And so my job is to find where God's leading us here and where that means for us today. One of the adages I remember with growing up, and I can't remember who it was that said this, but it's when you pray, you have the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. Because what we always do is we look for God and we look around the world and we say, where do I go in this? And so when I come to passages like this, my answer is, well, the story's not done, and I'm the one that finishes my part of the story. And so the question is, where do I go from here in our world? And it kind of puts the pressure back on me to find those answers and to find what we do here.
Well, it's sort of like an adult teaching their child. You don't tell a little child everything. They can't, I mean, well, they wouldn't understand it. So, yeah. I mean, someone said that God is constantly revealing himself to us. So we get a little more revelation every day as we go along. But we're not the end point. So we're being, and you can't, I mean, the child can't condemn the parent for not telling him everything when he was a little child because he couldn't have understood it.
Yeah.
And also Martin Luther King said the arc of something leads toward justice. The arc of life. I don't
of history? Is it
right.
history?
Pardon?
Is it the arc of history?
Arc of history, is that the word? Yeah. Yeah. So we're not at the end of the arc. We are on the path. So we can't judge, just like the founders of our country. We can't blame them for how they lived at that time. They didn't live where we are. Mm-hmm. They did the best they could at that particular time. And we're doing the best we can at our particular time, and we're trying to understand, and we're trying to open ourselves to God and see what he is telling us. But it's coming through a human being. So just because we say, this is what God said, doesn't mean that's what really God said. It's what I think he said.
Well, on every side claiming God, this victory for although they are fighting their, the Crusades, off of the, and this brings me back to Israel and Palestine. I mean, Netanyahu is not going to back off.
No.
And I mean, it's just such talk about genocide. That's already been happening.
Yeah.
It's just such, at what point? I mean, he's not interested in anything.
No.
But
I agree with what Posey's saying, just Hamas is not going to back off either.
no, everybody claims God. He's our God.
It's almost like people are messy and will always make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of them. Big
Yeah.
ones.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I go back to the idea of refuge cities. That to me, not that I find comfort when I look at other people's mistakes, but I find comfort that God accepts me with mine.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And he's still trying to reveal himself to me, even though I don't get it all. He's still trying to reveal himself to me.
We're seeing some of that God using flawed people and Christian nationalism, which again bring it into the political arena of this time.
All claiming God, God's on my side. No, God's on my side. It's
Yeah, like when two football teams pray
Sure.
to win. Well,
they all.
God can't answer both of their prayers.
Yeah, they all say the same prayer. Yeah.
Well, I'm impressed. It is 12:59, and we finished both of those conversations right around before 1. Does anyone have any last thoughts or things they have found comforting for themselves they want to share for the good of us or me?
Well, I like the
Open
story's
ourselves
not
up.
done.
Yeah, the story's not done yet, and you're a part of the story. N.T. Wright has this book that relates to kind of like how we read scripture. It gives the example. I'll end with this. So it's like we found this lost Shakespearean play, and so many Shakespearean plays will come into 5 movements, but we only found 4 of them. And so there's 2 groups who are like, we really want to finish this play. It was like his magnum opus. This was the last thing he was working toward. And so there's 2 approaches. One of them, we can get a whole bunch of Shakespearean scholars to go through and analyze all of his plays and what was going on in his life and try and lay it out for the geopolitics of the area. Or we could get a bunch of actors and say, become the characters, and then go up on stage and every time live out the play and see what happens. And we tend to have those same 2 approaches when we read the Bible. And the one that becomes really beautiful is when we become the people, we become the story, and we live out that story everywhere we go. And so there's my comfort to you. The story's not done yet, you're living it out. God's peace.
How old were the students that had not been taught about Romeo and Juliet? Please tell me.
7th grade.
7th grade.
I guess, do you